In case you missed last week, Pastor Audrey discussed the so-called Great Commission that concludes the Gospel of Matthew. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. It's a text with a painful history of consequences. The words themselves are attributed to a person who was executed by the Roman Empire and who taught love of even enemies. But the words have turned into a seedbed of sorts for Christian imperialism. The stories about Jesus healing people in today's gospel reading may seem disconnected from the liberating and anti-imperial message of Jesus that Audrey pointed us to last week. But I don't think that's the case. In fact, I'll suggest that our gospel reading this morning depicts Jesus tending the wounds of empire. Our text includes two healings, a leader's daughter who has died and a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. The story concludes with the dead daughter alive and the bleeding stopped. Biblical scholars reading these stories through a lens of disability studies raise some important critiques, and perhaps surprising ones for some of us. The stories can, for instance, perpetuate harmful ideas like the possibility of a complete and immediate cure if only a person has enough faith. Or they can unhelpfully suggest that disease is a result of sin. Aspects of these stories might not age well, like a fine wine or bourbon, but I think they are a major part of Matthew's story about Jesus. After Jesus calls a few disciples after his baptism and temptation, Matthew writes this: Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogue and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. This statement then provides the guiding categories that Matthew will use to tell his story about Jesus. He's a teacher, he's a proclaimer, he's a healer. In the very next verse, even, Matthew reports that they brought to him all the sick, and he cured them. While this broad and all-encompassing claim doesn't provide details about specific people healed, chapter 8 then mentions a number of specifics. There's a leper, a centurion's paralyzed boy servant, Peter's mother-in-law who had a fever, and so on. And after these specific episodes, Matthew offers another broad mention of Jesus healing many possessed by demons and that he cured all who were sick. In fact, Matthew's gospel has at least 10 of these encompassing statements about Jesus healing all or many. So when we meet the leader with a dead daughter and the woman who has been bleeding for 12 years, they are not marginal parts of Matthew's story about Jesus. Turning to biblical commentator Warren Carter, I was glad to see that he explores some of the same questions I began to ask myself. Just why exactly are there so many sick people in the Gospel of Matthew? And what do these stories tell us about Jesus? Carter will turn to the historical context and suggest that disease was common in the first century with a very clear source: the Roman Empire and its ways. Though some interpreters will construe these healing stories as metaphors for spiritual conditions, Carter takes a different approach. Quote, The numerous sick folks who populate chapters 8 and 9 embody the debilitating consequences of these unjust social structures and practices of Rome's empire. To elaborate, the Roman Empire was a hierarchical society with wealth and goods concentrated at the top. Of course, the wealth at the top came from those at the bottom, from whom it was extracted. And for those at the bottom, living conditions were characterized by things like a lack of adequate nutrition, sanitation, clean water, and so forth. The extractive nature of the empire produced these conditions that in turn produced a range of physical and mental illnesses. Again, to quote Carter, it is not surprising then that the gospel inscribes so many sick and suffering people. These sick and disabled bodies and lives reflect the somatically and mentally damaging impact of imperial power. Carter's argument about the ancient world has clear resonances with our own contemporary realities. An introduction to a 2023 NPR episode of Fresh Air notes that in 2020, the overall life expectancy in the U.S. dropped by 1.5 years, largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That loss, however, was not felt the same amongst different racial groups. On average, white people lost 1.2 years, a bit under the national average. Black and Hispanic people lost, on average, 3 years, twice the national average. And Native Americans lost 4.5 years, 3 times the national average. To explain disparities like these, the episode then focuses on the work of Arlene Geronimus, a public health researcher who makes the case that marginalized people suffer nearly constant stress from living with poverty and discrimination, which damages bodies at the cellular level and leads to increasingly serious health problems over time. In other and no doubt simplistic words, poverty and discrimination takes a toll on bodies, negatively impacting both physical and mental health. While there are, I think, some clear gaps in our lectionary text, I'd like to consider them again in terms of these dynamics. The text does not say what caused the death of the leader's daughter, but it's easy enough to connect it to the empire. Carter notes that half of children born in the first century didn't live to age 5. The early years were fragile. And so the scenario Matthew imagines here of a child dying is one that would have been a common part of life under the empire. Why? Well, take your pick of any number of the toxic ways of empire: wars, wealth inequality, disparate access to quality nutrition, sanitation, clean water. Viewed in these sort of terms, Jesus' healing of the leader's daughter amounts to tending the wounds of empire. That is, Jesus is seeking to restore to health what the empire has sickened. With the second person in this story, the woman who has been bleeding for 12 years, I'm not sure there's as clear of a way to connect what she experiences directly to the realities of empire. As before, there are gaps in our text. Is she of high status like the leader? And why has she been bleeding for 12 years? Interpreters have often assumed that this is some sort of uterine bleeding, but the story does not even mention the purity categories of clean or not clean that we might expect if that was the case. Instead, the text notes how long it's been happening, 12 years, and its impact on her. It has made her suffer. Sometimes wounds are long-lasting and hard to diagnose. It's tempting to say simply that Jesus then healed her, but that's not quite what Jesus says. Rather, when he sees her, he says, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well." Did Jesus or her faith heal her? If we view what this woman experiences as related to the ill effects of empire, Jesus' work is again one in which the wounds of empire are tended. I think we could even say that Jesus is engaged in decolonizing work, working to undo or heal the harms of empire. So what do we take from this text? Perhaps we should begin holding Benny Hinn-style services focusing on miraculous healings and revival. Just kidding. Instead, what I think we should do is begin by exploring where we are conscious of the wounds of empire among us. This Lent, we engaged in a community art project that we called Victims of Empire. In case you missed it, we worked from the idea that the Roman Empire used the cross to publicly humiliate those who threatened Rome's power. From that idea, we then pinned images of those who were likewise victims of today's empires to the cross. It was an effort to mourn and lament the impacts of empires among us. We identified numerous wounds, including people impacted by capitalism as reflected by this dollar bill. And if you're wondering why there's a lifesaver there, I suspect it has something to do with Stan. There was also an image of the earth, and there were various images suggestive of LGBTQIA+ people, like a rainbow fan or a trans flag. Other images pointed to the impacts on immigrants, like an image of Renee Good or Liam Ramos or Anul, who some of us knew. There was also a face mask, suggestive of the masks that ICE agents wear. There was a Free Palestine sign and a Palestinian flag. There were images of the graves for and faces of the Iranian schoolgirls killed in a U.S. missile strike. There were images related to indigenous people, including at Oak Flat. No doubt you could add other examples of the sickening effects of empires today. As we think about tending wounds of empire like these, I'm reminded that disability activists critique the ways that these stories risk creating a false hope for complete and instantaneous cures. And to be clear, that's not what I'm thinking about. Instead, I'm thinking about something like what many of us did yesterday, showing up for a pride parade, proclaiming that LGBTQIA+ people are beloved children of God in a world that often seeks to silence or erase LGBTQIA people with profound harms to their physical and mental health. I think also about our hosting of a series on local indigenous history in a world that has similarly sought to erase indigenous people and their stories. Or I think about stories I hear from Gary Barber volunteering with the Valley Watch Network to make sure that people released from ICE custody can make it safely to their train and with a backpack full of supplies for their journey. No doubt you can add other examples of what tending the wounds of empire might look like for us today. If you're anything like me, when you hear tending the wounds of empire today, you probably think about doing this work for others. That is, how can I tend the wounds of others? But I'm learning that this work involves more than that. James Baldwin, for instance, in an article describing his impressions of Martin Luther King Jr., writes that he'd overheard King suggesting, quote, "Bigotry was a disease, and that the greatest victim of this disease was not the bigot's object, but the bigot himself." Likewise, in Unsettling Truths, a book we read last fall, Mark Charles and Seung-Chan Rah contend that the doctrine of discovery did not just harm indigenous people. It also harmed those who inflicted those harms, itself a traumatic wound with transgenerational effects. Without wanting to suggest that these sort of harms are in any way equivalent, I think tending the wounds of empire today must include a fearless search of all the places that the empire has wrought its devastation, including among those of us who have benefited from its ways. Maybe this looks like learning the stories one didn't learn growing up. Maybe it looks like repenting of harmful theological constructs, like those that define some types of people as bearing more of the image of God than others, or of theologies that define humans as separate from, rather than as part of nature. Whatever tending the wounds of empire looks like for us today, I think that's what these stories call us to. It is the very work that part of our new mission statement tries to capture, fostering wholeness. I look forward to this work with you. Amen.